I want to welcome everyone who's already in the session right now. We're at 21 participants and the numbers keep coming up. My name is Agustina Gancia. I'm a senior project officer at Health Translation SA. I look after the capacity building and consumer engagement programs within our organization. We're really excited to launch this month's Spotlight series on the Medical Research Future Fund and hope everyone gets something out of all the information that we'll be sharing across this month. So today's webinar number 1 of 4. So to begin, I will actually pass the baton to Wendy, who's our CEO, and she can open up the series with a few introductory slides. Yes, so Wendy, I'll stop sharing and you can start sharing your presentation.
Sure, actually, Agustina, why don't you leave it up and I'll just say, go to the next slide. Okay. That's fine. So you can get going. Yeah.
All right.
So firstly,
yes,
I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting on Kaurna land and that I want to pay my respect to traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, recognise the Kaurna people and their cultural, spiritual, physical and emotional connection to the land, and honour and pay respects to the Kaurna elders, both past and present, and all generations of Kaurna people now and into the future. Now, I know there's probably a number of you who aren't on Kaurna land, so I'd like to also pay respects to the lands, the people on the lands that you are sitting, and particularly Christine, I think you're coming from Sydney at the moment, but there's probably a bunch of you all over the place. So just to acknowledge the importance of the work we are doing with our Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal colleagues to really improve a whole lot of things within the Aboriginal community. So yeah, that's the acknowledgement. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's this Spotlight series thing that we're talking about? This is actually the 3rd Spotlight series that HTSA has been running. We started this at late 2021 with the first one, which is an implementation science Spotlight series. And as a result of that, we're just about to launch oh, that's gone. Sorry. Go back up, that's right. As a result of the implementation Spotlight series, we're actually launching a community of practice across South Australia in implementation science. That's going to be led by 2 of our leading lights in that area, Gillian Harvey and Professor Natasha Howard, and they'll be reaching out to people over the next few months to join that community of practice. So these are things that we are really putting a spotlight on for a month. Typically they include 4 sessions, but we are looking to say what else do we do afterwards to make sure that we can cement the information and the learnings into the culture of South Australia. For many of you, you'll be well aware of HTSA, but I'm going to give you a bit of a blurb on that in a moment. But definitely today's webinar, we have Professor Christine Jorm providing an overview of the MRFF from the MRFF's perspective, which is incredibly valuable, and also Dr. Jo Close giving a perspective from the MTP Connect and the work that she's doing here in South Australia. Importantly, we actually did a session working with Salin and Flinders University. We did an MRFF summit a couple of months ago, and that was really an opportunity to again start talking about the MRFF and how people can really understand the differences of the MRFF and how they can really work with the MRFF to get more money into really impactful projects into South Australia. The other thing I wanted to mention before I go on to this next slide is that HTSA have established and continue to invest and facilitate an MRFF working group across the state that has representatives from all the universities and many of the health services now, including consumers and other interested groups, other interested government officers, to really be thinking strategically about the MRFF. So today is not the start of the MRFF journey for SA and for Health Translation SA. We've been trying to reorient people around South Australia to take the MRFF seriously and really promote the opportunities within the state, but also apply for grants and really think carefully about how you do that with the MRFF, because that's the part of the job of HTSA, is to be a catalyst and a broker. Hence our purpose on the slide, to accelerate the translation of research findings into healthcare practice and policy and increase whole of system research translation capacity. That's why Agostina's got a job, and the whole of system research translation capacity is part of what we're doing with these Spotlight series. Next slide, please. So the way we work is that we partner with our partners, and we've got 11 active partners, which are all the universities, SA Health, the 2 primary health networks, the Aboriginal Health Council, Torrens University, Flinders, Adelaide and UniSA, and of course SAMRI. And I've probably forgotten somebody there, but we have the Aboriginal Health Council as well. I think I mentioned that. But anyway, we've got 11 active partners all working together to really boost what's going on in our state. But our role particularly is working as an independent catalyst and broker to mobilise collaborations that address the major health challenges in South Australia. We do want to make sure that consumers and community involvement is pivotal to what those priorities are, but we appreciate the importance of policy, we appreciate the importance of research, of course, and embedding research within policy and health services to make that difference. So that's really, in essence, what we're up to. So we look at a research translation pipeline. We think about a mindset of going across from starting to activities, moving across to outputs, outcomes, impact, and then thinking about how it is scaled and sustained. And there's no doubt that is the hard bit. That's why we need the whole state to be thinking in this way and connecting up with the rest of Australia and internationally. But really it's about what is the problem we are trying to address, and who is the next users and the end users of our research and our activity, and are they involved right at the start instead of bringing them in at the end when we want them to adopt something that we've identified. It's really a mindset about knowing that problem and then working with those users and the people that it matters to right at the start. So that's really part of the vision of HTSA. So I think that's all I get to say today, except to say that our first Spotlight series was implementation science. Our next one was around research impact, and we spent a good lot of time thinking about that, and there's a lot of resources available for you if you weren't part of that, and you can also look over and listen to those things. We've got this one as our third, and we're also looking to do 2 more, one more this year in consumer engagement, and then we'll continue to roll them out next year, and we've got a range of ideas around what next year will look like. So with that, I'll pass it back to Agostina, and she'll introduce our first guest, and I really thank Christine John for being available. She's a great colleague of mine from a number of years, and I'm really happy to have her here today. So back to you, Agostina.
Thanks, Wendy. Great introduction. And now it's my turn to introduce Professor Christine Jorm, who's joining us from the Health and Medical Research Office at the Department of Health. Professor Jorm has doctorates in neuropharmacology and sociology, and she's a fellow of the Australian and New Zealand College of Anaesthetists. She's practiced for more than 15 years before her interests led her to work in patient safety and quality. She was also the director of the New South Wales Regional Health Partners, and she's currently the principal research scientist for the office, the Health and Medical Research Office at the Department of Health. So today she'll give us an overview of the MRFF. And yeah, over to you, Christine. Thanks for joining us today.
Look, thank you very much for the invitation. I think, you know, these are exciting times for all of us. As a public servant now, the frisson of new government is all around us, and no one's quite sure what it's going to mean for a lot of areas. Certainly, the new government has moved to act quickly in a number of places. So it is entirely possible that changes will happen to the MRFF. I have no evidence of changes. There were no pre-election promises, but you know, these things are likely as government turns their new government turns their attention to reform, you know, across the public service and across expenditures. So that's going to be interesting. But it's essentially an exciting time for us. So I'm just, here we are. Now I'm going to focus on really I'll go over some of the early slides quite quickly because it's a lot of stuff that's in the public domain. And I know for most of you in the audience, probably your major concern is a focus on how you can get funded by the MRFF. So I think that's the bit to really emphasise. And South Australia has been very successful in achieving MRFF funding. And I think it's because of the flexibility and the willingness to embrace new ways of working in research. That is exactly the kind of thing that Health Translation SA is catalysing across the state. And that will keep on being rewarded under these focus that we have on really doing research a little bit differently. So the MRFF is different for a couple of reasons. And when we talk about different, we mean different from the NH and MRC. And this discussion may be different in a few years' time, where the NH and MRC might be saying how we're different from the MRFF. I mean, it is the newcomer, but it does represent an equal amount of government money and a very substantial investment in health and medical research. So it's different in its emphasis on being flexible. So in terms of getting money out for things like bushfire smoke research or COVID research, it's a vehicle where government can quickly procure research in essence. It's a priority-led fund, and rather than a investigator-led process. And often the focus has been on areas of unmet needs or technologies with transformational potential. But always it's very outcome-focused, emphasis on the potential for commercialisation or transformation of the health system, impact on patient outcomes. And we use innovative research approaches and are continually devising new grant models. And that's one story there, that no grant is the same as the next one. And that's important for researchers to think about. We've already funded $2 billion in research funding across 742 grants, and funds are available in future years for allocation to priorities. On the right there is the MRFF budget and expenses, and the 10-year investment plan, which is the sort of checky bit, are the commitments that have been made, you know, going forward for the next 10 years at this point in time. But those commitments are under quite broad headings. So when we're talking about primary care, there's many aspects of primary care that could be specifically targeted in a heading like that, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of documents. There's the MRFF Act, which has the legislation, there's a strategy, there's priority areas for investments, there's a 10-year plan, and there's a monitoring, evaluation and learning strategy. And the strategy was developed by the Australian Medical Research Advisory Board, AMRAB, following stakeholder consultation. And the vision is something that we would all be so supportive of. You know, a health system fully informed by quality health and medical research. All of this is available online. The AMRAB priorities come into force no later than the 5th of November this year, when the current priorities expire. Now, the new priorities start there, at the very top there, Wendy, no, it's not in any order, with consumer-driven research, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, other priority populations, research infrastructure. comparative effectiveness, microbial resistance, and you'll notice health impacts from environmental factors there. And many people are very pleased that that has come forward clearly as a priority. And it's going to be interesting to see how much emphasis that may get in the next couple of years. All right, in the investment plan, it retains and carries forward all the funding allocated from the existing plan, retains the 4 funding themes: patients, research, missions, researchers and translation, and the 20 initiatives. What's different is a new MRFF initiative was added, and that's that's support for early to mid-career researchers to enable them to work on major health challenges. And some enhancement and expansion of existing initiatives, clinical trials, preventative and public health, primary healthcare, and commercialisation. And then the initiatives listed below have been, extended. So that's the kind of rough story. Each of the missions has an expert working group, roadmap and implementation plan. Some of the missions now are reaching the stage of evaluation. The evaluation of the mental health mission should be completed shortly. And a new advisory groups are starting to be formed, and new thinking about the next bit of roadmap, because the office has learned and everybody has learned from the first experience of the first round of these. There's a lot of emphasis on evaluation of the fund. In fact, in my opinion, too much, but that's because we sit within government and they tend to view research in the same way as any other investment. And the fact that research is always a gamble, that the really strong outcomes from research are a long way in the future, is very hard to explain to people who are looking for a simpler acquittal of public money. But here are our broad categories in which success is measured. And they're hard things to measure. When we're talking about embedding new interventions in practice or adopting best practices faster, all of you as scientists can see the difficulties in actually designing measures around things like this. But this is the approved version, and measures are indeed being designed. Now, applying for MRFF grants. So all the grants sit under something. So they sit under a theme, initiative, and the grant opportunity sits underneath it. So this is important. So you've got to look quite closely at an application. The title of the application is sometimes, of the grant opportunity, is sometimes vague. And you need to look below it into the objectives and outcomes, eligibility and selection criteria in some detail. They always align with priorities. And so work and a design of an application that aligns with the priorities is very desirable. And your things have to meet the objective of the initiative it sits within. For instance, if we're doing something under the primary healthcare research initiative, primary care needs to be the focus of grants. And does require researchers to identify how their proposed work will contribute to the MRFF measures of success. Now, the assessment criteria are focused on outcomes: impact, methodology, capacity, capability, resources, and overall value and risk. And the actual grant models themselves are quite variable from grant to grant. And we're just starting to offer some smaller grants than we have in the past, and some really interesting results from doing that, actually very productive, I think. So impact, project impact is really important. So this is how well something aligns with the objectives and intended outcomes of the grant opportunity. And while I fully understand the enthusiasm that researchers have to find any possible way they might get their work funded, in reality, if something does not align with the objectives and outcomes very well, it's likely to be thrown out. So the work is then wasted. So I think that's a decision to be made every time you're thinking about putting a grant in, because it is, if it is off focus for the objective and outcomes, it's a problem. Then it's important to put in a bit about the MRFF measures of success, and then you've got the methodology. That bit's usually straightforward. What's important, though, is to look clearly at the assessment criteria. So project impact is worth a great deal. And sometimes we see grants where their focus has mainly been on project methodology. Fantastic methodology, but they just sort of skim over this sort of impact. This is not a good thing. Capacity, capability and resources to deliver the project. The applications have been coming in, are very strong on this in general. We're looking at times, there are a lot of questions that come in at times about whether partners' contributions are real or not, or whether they're just saying it. And so if you have a partner who's putting cash or in kind, really good to be very specific about the level of support that you're getting from a health service partner or similar, because it really helps your application. The overall value and risk is a non-weighted thing, but if the overall value and risk is not good or excellent, the project won't be funded. So occasionally we'll see projects where the project's quite good, and this is not me assessing them, this is as an observer, and this is observing the peer review panels, but there's a sort of big budget element that's probably not necessary, and there is no negotiation, there is no discussion, there is no cutting that element. The project may then be rated poorly for value and not got funded, which is sometimes, you know, sometimes I find it quite heartbreaking. There'd be a beautiful project. If only you could tell them you shouldn't have added that extra, you know, 800,000 was something that you didn't perhaps really need, and you just thought you'd go to the maximum value for the grant, you know. So going to the maximum value is not always a strategic choice at all. Wendy, you're having a collapse. She's see her falling over there. Okay. So for all the technical criteria, the grants must score 4 or above, and to be considered, and then they get ranked on how well they do overall. So, and these are complicated criteria. We've certainly done some early in-house analysis, and a well-designed approach to consumer engagement is clearly impacting on the final score. And that was one of the intentions of the design of these grant opportunities, and to make consumers more front and centre in health research. And it does seem to be actually working. So it's an important thing again for all of you here as researchers looking for success. This is a slide that I wrote. The other ones have been Saraid's when I was talking to the Flinders group. And there's a lot of frustration at times about not knowing what the MRFF grant calls might be, or how to prepare for them in advance. And, you know, and that is because our work is subject to ministerial discretion and sign off, and the timelines and exact details can be difficult for us to predict. But there's some things you can't do in a hurry. And one is build real partnerships. So I guess it dovetails nicely with some of the things that Wendy was introducing. If you can evidence true partnerships with policy groups, clinical groups, consumers, interstate groups, you are so much better positioned to do a grant. And you can't create partnerships quickly. So this is absolute priority, whatever your area is, whatever your area of research, find your friends, in these areas, start working with them, talking to them, helping them with their work, whatever it is. It's not all about money. And that's going to strengthen your chance of having a compelling research application. Multidisciplinary is very prized in some of the MRFF criteria, and what the term means is at times debatable, but it's good to think about what it might look like in your field. Certainly sitting on grant panels where we have had applications from medical doctors only, like 6 of them. And people are like, where's the physios? Where's the nurses? When it was so obvious that the thing they wanted to do involved many other kinds of professionals in the care of patients. So surprising in 2022 to be seeing that kind of narrow lens, and grant assessment committees are looking for a broader understanding of both clinical interdisciplinarity, but also looking at cross-fertilization from other research areas, where possible. So that's a really important thing to think about in advance. And then when writing, it's important to consider the possible grant assessment committee composition. We actually have more policy people, health service implementers, people of that kind on our committees. And then, well, they haven't been on NH and MRC committees. So we have people who have really good insight into feasibility and impact, but they're not going to be so familiar with the dense nature of traditional grant applications. And writing something that is making sure what you write is really well written and really readable is going to help you a lot with those committee members. They're all smart people, but I think it's very important that you prepare and think about the readers of your work at that committee end. And then finally, the clear focus on and towards health outcomes. We've all thought so much more about research impact, but the feeling that I'm just going to write some more papers when I've done this may be the case. But in the modern world, you really do have to have that drive towards the change it's going to make in the world if it's successful. And not all research is going to be successful. In fact, most of it isn't. But that is the vision that you're selling with a grant application. So in terms of program updates, we've got a lot of grant opportunities that were announced prior to the election. 301 million announced in December. And these are all on our website. And then more in the budget and so on. The ones that are really hot at the moment, of course, you'd have a lot of people in the room who've been perhaps working on their early to mid-career researchers grant. These close on the 13th of July, and they have a couple of different models, an incubator accelerator and a targeted call for research model. And this whole new initiative stemmed from feedback from the sector and roundtables held with EMCRs and their employers. We also have a clinician researchers grant opportunity open, nurses focused on nurses midwives at Allied Health. And this one is quite an exciting one because these are groups who've been historically underfunded for their health and medical research work. And it's really excellent that we're able to get targeted funding out to them. I'm not going to talk about this one because you have the people from the BTF here, which is even better. So in this year, AMRAD is going to consult with the sector on the following areas. And it'd be really great to have some strong input from South Australia when it happens. The first is consumer and clinician involvement in research. And you guys have done a lot of leading work in that area already. Second two are harder, health and medical research workforce development, because I don't think we've done anything like the thinking about the research workforce that has occurred around something like the clinical workforce. I mean, how big should it be? Who's supposed to be in it? I don't think it's clear. And then the hardest one of all is research quality. Again, a very ambiguous statement and, you know, quite challenging to consider. So it'd be really good to have some big input from South Australia on those topics when it happens. AMRAB works regularly with the NH and MRC, and we're always keen to get feedback from the sector. It surprises me how little feedback we get. So we get the odd angry letter, but it's very rare that we get a really considered piece that says this happened, we think this, what about this, how can we help you with it? Those kind of pieces actually quite influential. I'm surprised how rarely DBCRs write, and because it's you know, it's an opportunity, there is opportunity to change things and improve things. Particularly if there are things obviously within our ability to improve. It's no good complaining to us about the NH and MRC Sapphire system, for instance. But in terms of the bits of the grant design and assessment process and so on that within our gift, very much look to have feedback to see how we can make it better. Certainly in my own team, we're very focused at the moment on looking at researcher burden, the elements of it, and what opportunities that you might have as a funder to be able to reduce researcher burden. So that's the end there. Any questions?
There's no questions in the chat. If anyone has any additional questions, I think what we can do is table them for now, and we can jump over to Joe's presentation and then have a little window for Q&A after both presentations, just to ensure that Joe has all the time necessary for her presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen to introduce Joe, and then she can start with her presentation. So Joe is joining us. Thanks, first of all, Christine, that was such an informative presentation, and I'm sure people will have gotten so much from it. We'll come back to you at the Q&A. For Joe, she's joining us from MTP Connect, and she's a director of the Adelaide Intermediary Program. She's a health and medical scientist with deep experience in health, medical technologies, and pharmaceutical sectors, driving and delivering high impact initiatives. So yes, over to you, Joe. Happy to have you here with us. I'll stop sharing and you can start now.
Thank you. I'll see if I can share the screen.
Yeah.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone this morning. As you mentioned, I am the director of the Adelaide Intermediary Program. So for some of you, you may know what that means. For others, it might be a whole brand new concept. That's because we're really quite new in South Australia. If you're familiar with South Australia's Excite strategy, you may know that that is all about excellent research, collaboration, innovation and translation across South Australia. And part of the Excite strategy recognised the fact that we have invested so heavily in capital works, in buildings and infrastructure, but that we need to have the soft capacity to connect people. And so external innovation and translation intermediaries were formed, and we are the intermediary for Adelaide Biomed City. So our role is to increase research collaborations, increase knowledge transfer, expand technology capability and grow revenue exports. And that's what we're doing here. But to take a step back and to talk about MTP Connect and why MTP Connect is in South Australia, hopefully some of you are already familiar with MTP Connect. We are the National Industry Growth Centre for MedTech, Pharma, Biotech and Digital Health. I was looking at Wendy's slide before, and it actually looks very similar. And we have got a very similar slide about the way that we work with stakeholders right across Australia. We've been in existence now for 7 years. And when we talk about the changes in government, I'm pleased to say that Labor has actually said that they're going to keep the industry growth centres, so MTP Connect looks like it's going to be around for quite some time. We work with all of the stakeholders in the sector. Those on the left-hand side are just examples of those that we work with in the sector. But essentially, we have 4 key objectives, and these have been our objectives since the very beginning of MTP Connect's time. And that is to increase collaboration and commercialisation, to improve management and workforce skills, to optimise the regulatory environment, and to improve access to global supply chains. So when we talk about the MRFF schemes and how MTP Connect relates to that, we have a significant role to play because we're starting to administer a range of MRFF schemes that really focus on increasing collaboration and commercialisation across the sector and building the skills. So what I'm going to take the opportunity today to do is tell you about those programs that MTP Connect is really heavily involved in, give you some tips and hints about how to best position applications to those programs, and then tell you about the ones that are currently online. So MTP Connect as an industry growth centre was initially funded through the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. That's how we began. But now we administer over $180 million of funds. And you can see on the right-hand side the 5 programs that we have under Medical Research Future Fund, where we're providing largely translational research grant funding, but also capacity building programs across the sector. This gives you a picture of where all of these grant funding programs sit in terms of what they're delivering. So you can see we have a number of programs that focus on research projects. So we have our Biomedical Translation Horizon program. Now that one is fully funded. We're just closing off projects now, but that essentially focused on the biotech and medtech space. And we're helping organisations achieve proof of concept. That particular scheme was the first one that MTP Connect administered on behalf of MRFF. And over time, you'll see as I talk about these different programs, we've really started to evolve the way that we deliver these programs and the offerings that we provide to support around them. BMTH was focused on particular clinical areas and across rounds that evolved. And that goes back to Christine's comment about the MRFF and the way that it really rapidly responds to priority areas. The Biomedical Translation Bridge was also on biotech and medtech, and essentially it went from discovery to proof of concept. Our Targeted Translational Research Accelerator is ongoing, and that has both research projects and a research centres component to it. And our most recent MRFF program that's come online is our Clinical Translation and Commercialisation of Medtech. And as it says in its name, it's very much focused on medtech, and that one is about clinical validation. The other MRFF scheme that we look after is the Researcher Exchange and Development with Industry. And so this is particularly focused on training programs and fellowships and internships because it's all about building the capacity of the system. To give an overview of really what our MRFF R&D programs look like, so I talk about those that sit within the research projects or the centre bucket, there's a few key aspects that you should know about those. The first is they're very much aligned with priorities. So Christine's already talked about the MRFF priorities, and of course they sit within that. But MTP Connect has a sector competitiveness plan that it brings out annually. That's a very forward-focused document about what is happening in our sector and where we see the future lying. And so in all of the grant programs that we administer, it's really important to understand that so you can align with what's happening in the sector. The other key one for us is the Medical Products National Manufacturing Roadmap. That sets out where Australia is trying to go in terms of manufacturing. And when you think of manufacturing, just be careful. It's not just about production, it is about pre-production and post-production. And Australia has a lot to offer in that space. And everything that we do is about addressing identified gaps. And so sometimes those gaps are already identified by MRFF, but there's a whole range of activities that we do to identify gaps within our sector. And I'll speak a little bit more of that when I come to the Researcher Exchange and Development with Industry program. The programs that we administer are very much translation focused. And when you think of translation, you need to think about what is the next inflection point that you need to get to in order to add value to that technology so that it's getting pushed down the line so that ultimately it can receive and it can achieve a health benefit. So some of the measures that we look at when we're thinking about translation is obviously innovations, patents, products, jobs, and investment. At the end of the day, if we're seeing that translation occur into the industry, those things will be apparent to us. All of our programs are actually milestone based when they're delivered. So we only provide funding on the basis of successful achievement of milestones. It's really important to note that, because even though you may be successful in being awarded funds from MTP Connect through these MRFF schemes, if you don't meet your milestones, your funding is at risk. And we have had projects that we've had to terminate because of that. We've also had projects that we've had to terminate because the research just didn't turn out the way anticipated. And we all know this, the research is that way. It is unknown by its nature, and particularly when it comes to translation, sometimes the research just doesn't translate. Over time, through our MRFF schemes, we've developed a partnership model to the way that we deliver these schemes. And you'll see that when I bring up each of them, get a better understanding of who we partner with and why we partner with them. But essentially, it's to leverage strengths right across Australia, to have more people on the ground and to have that expert insight so that we can provide support around the funds that we give. For us, it's not just about providing funding, it's very much about getting a successful outcome from the grants that we administer. And so that's where that value add comes in. Right from the outset, when we provide feedback on grant applications as they come in through the system, and you'll see from our grant application process that it's a little bit unique. We do provide mentoring and support along the projects. In some instances, there's an educational component that sits right alongside the project funding being awarded, and we're very tight on our project management, which goes back to that milestone-based payments. We have a multi-stage application process, and we know how busy people are, and we don't want to waste people's time writing applications. It's really important that we have some clear information that needs to go on into those forms, but essentially we have a two-stage process so that we don't ask people for too much information up front, so that we make sure we filter the right applications going through to full application, and we actually work with the applicants from the expression of interest to the application stage, because we want them to be successful. So to talk about what that application pathway usually looks like, I've already alluded to this, but it starts off with an expression of interest, and then that goes through a selection panel to make sure that first it is eligible, it meets all of the basic criteria, but also that we understand what questions we have, because we have teams that go out and consult with those that get through the expression of interest stage before they move to a full proposal. So when we talk about that consultation process, this is where a lot of our partners come in. They will give you feedback on your expression of interest, and they'll ask many more questions. Sometimes those questions are really part of that mentoring process, so they're really valuable for you. Sometimes they're also really important for us to filter out which applications should move forward to a full proposal. Once we've got full proposals, we do have an investment panel that looks at those before moving to awards. So that's kind of the typical process that you would see with a grant application. Christine spoke about the selection criteria for the broad MRFF schemes. Within the schemes that we administer, typically they have 5 different merit criteria that they need to stack up against. And this is really important. And Christine already spoke to this, is that impact is really important. And so when we think about that challenge and the solution, it really shouldn't be overlooked. It needs to be in a priority area. The project really needs to tell a story about how the impact will be realised. It needs to differentiate from what is already out there. We don't want to be funding Me Too innovations. And you need to articulate what the competitive advantage is and who your competitors are. One of the things that we find with the grant application process is that sometimes people try to finesse the grant way too much, that they just put in all the good stuff. We actually want to know, from a realistic perspective, all of the elements that need to be thought about in your project. And so the more transparent you are about that, the more likely you are for success in the application process. When it comes to the technical merit, this is probably the bit that people are most familiar with from other grant schemes. It's about identifying those innovative design features. We do think about scalability early on, so that it's not just about getting to a proof of concept, but also thinking about beyond proof of concept, how it will be scaled. And we always look for that end user feedback, because that tells us that it has been validated that it is a real problem. When it comes to the project plan, this is also about being really pragmatic. We don't like people to be vague. It has to have clear deliverables and outcomes. And we do want the risks identified. And there's nothing worse than a project plan that comes to us that doesn't have risks. Every project has risks. All of those risks need to be managed. So be transparent about that. Translation and commercialisation is, of course, very important to us. Without projects being translated or commercialised, they're not going to receive the benefit that we intend them to receive from the investment that we make in research. So that comes down to the IP, the business model, the commercialisation strategy, the market. There's a lot to consider when it comes to translation and commercialisation. And finally, the team and capabilities. Of course, experience and track record is incredibly important. But we also look for diversity, and we look for a diversity across a whole range of parameters. So obviously, increasingly, people are concerned about gender diversity. We're also talking about diversity of expertise, and diversity of expertise isn't just about discipline areas. It's about having the diversity that would make up a really great company. So you've got regulatory experts, you've got researchers, you've got business managers, you've got patent attorneys. All of that is part of your team, and they don't have to be directly employed by your organisation for them to be noted as being part of the team. That's really, really important. Another thing that I'll just briefly mention without going through is technology readiness levels. So one of the key things that we're looking at with the grants that we fund from a translational perspective is how are we moving this innovation up the technology readiness scale? If you haven't seen a technology readiness level chart like this, I suggest you go away and have a look at it. Essentially, it sets out quite clearly where you are in the process of your product development. And what we like to see is an increase of about 3 levels of technology readiness level. And in the applications, we like you to be really clear about how far you'll be down the line and where you're going to be up to. Now let me jump into the specific grant programs, and I'm going to start with the Biomed Tech Horizons program. And this was the first program that we were funded by the MRFF to administer. This now is a closed program, but it ran over 4 years and across 4 rounds. The intention of this particular funding scheme was to take medical technologies from proof of concept to a commercially validated proof of concept. And this covered both medical devices and therapeutics. So it was a broad call. However, in each one of those rounds, we had particular clinical areas that it targeted, and they were driven by the MRFF's priority areas. I have just put some stats in South Australia on some of these slides where we have them for your interest. And you'll see that the first program, the BMTH, only had 4 South Australian projects funded. And what we have seen with the MRFF schemes that MTP Connect has administered is that we did get a low application rate in South Australia to begin with, and that is quickly increasing as we get subsequent rounds. And hopefully with MTP staff on the ground in South Australia, we can do an even better job of connecting people with the schemes that they fit with. As examples there, you can see there was funding to anatomics. There's a South Australian one there, which is Corinna Biotech. And also one that was working on instrumentation. So through that scheme, they got up to $1 million for the project, and it didn't require any matching funding. The next program to come online was the Biomedical Translation Bridge. And one of the big changes that we had to the way that we were administering MRFF schemes was that partnership model. So you can see across the top, for this particular scheme, we've partnered with BioCurate, UniQuest, Medical Device Partnering Program, which is part of Flinders University, and the Bridge and Bridge Tech programs, which are part of QUT. The intention of having this partnership model meant that we could bring a whole range of expertise to the way that we assessed and provided support for applicants in the grant scheme. So rather than just have that typical application process and throw money across the fence, this was very much about getting all of those experts from the partnering organisations to take part in mentoring the companies as they went through this program. So BTB also funded both medical devices and therapeutics, and the intent was to reach proof of concept and make them investable. The BTB provided up to $1 million of funding, and that was match funding. And like I said, that came with mentoring and project management along the way. There were 4 South Australian projects funded, 3 of those are there on the screen. We had Envision Sciences, LBT Innovations, and the University of Adelaide partnered with a company for their Zika virus vaccine to get into a new needle-free delivery mechanism. The third of the programs is our Targeted Translation Research Accelerator, and this one is currently active. So the TTRA is in partnership with And Health. Hopefully some of you are familiar with And Health. They provide digital health training across Australia and increasingly becoming somewhat of a peak organisation in the digital health space. UniQuest was also a partner as well as MDPP and partnered with the Australian Centre for Health Services Innovation. Now, TTRA is really quite an interesting one because not only does TTRA deliver research projects, but it also established 2 centres. So this, like I said, was specifically focused on diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so the first thing that they did was pull together applications for centres, and they funded 2 centres, the Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovation, so that's ACADI, and the other one is ASHRA, the Australian Stroke and Heart Research Accelerator. And MTP Connect is just about to release some videos about those 2 centres if you want to find out more. But the other part of that are those research projects. And so TTRA is in the process of going through the first round of funded, they have given out 4 funded projects in the first round. Unfortunately, South Australia didn't get any of those, but there are 2 additional rounds. The second round is currently being reviewed, and the third round is coming up in possibly January. So for that funding, you can get between 200,000 and 750,000. There is a 50% co-contribution. Both research organisations and companies are eligible for that. And again, this is one that comes with mentoring and project management support. So it's a $47 million program. Finally, the clinical translation and commercialisation of medtech. That one was first offered this year, and you can see we've seen some similar partners again, being the Medical Device Partnering Program and the Bridge Tech Program, but it also brought together the Medical Technology Association of Australia, Cicada Innovations, that delivers a lot of medtech training programs and originates out of New South Wales, and Therapeutic Innovation Australia, which is in fact an NCRIS infrastructure organisation and is providing access to infrastructure and expertise as part of this program and as part of that kind of wrap of additional benefits that you get when you get funded by a program like this. As the name suggests, it's specifically focused on medical devices that have commercial potential, and it does need to have a stage of clinical development in that project. This scheme is actually really generous because it's not just about funding that clinical part, but it's also about helping the company really get all of the IP commercialisation activities that it needs as well. So you can get up to 1.5 million with that particular program. Now I'm aware of time, so I am going to quickly flip through the last of the slides and tell you about our READY program. But I'll just briefly touch on this one to say that as we have been receiving funds as an organisation, MTP Connect, so have others organisations. So online is the curator screen that's delivered by Brand and Capital, and Health has a specific digital health activity that is delivered as part of the MRFF funds. So finally, the READY, I mentioned this, READY does fellowships and training programs. I won't go on too much about this except to tell you that our fellowship scheme is currently open and closes on the 27th of July, so please look out for that. You can get up to 250,000 with this fellowship. And what's really exciting about this fellowship is that it sees anyone from an early career researcher to a more advanced researcher actually spend up to 12 months in a company and then go back to their research organisation. The intent is for them to really be able to build those industry collaborations so that they have a better understanding of what's going on in industry and how to develop a product, and bring those skills and expertise back to universities. So that is one that I would look out for, and like I said, is funded through the MRFF. We have a whole range of other training programs that people can get access to, and because they are MRFF funded through the READY scheme, they are relatively cheap. So I'm going to flip through these, but we've got anything from quality management system training to training on funding programs. We've got business operations training. We also have a whole bunch of commercialisation training programs that we support. So do make use of those. There's more internships and industry placements. Some of these names might be familiar, like the APR intern program, the Bridge program that provides education. So please do take a look at it. It's all available on our website. That gives you an overview of the MRFF funded programs that MTP Connect delivers. Within South Australia, we have a team of 4 now through the Adelaide Intermediary Program. So if you do want further information or advice on any of these programs, we like people to be successful. And you know, that goes for everyone that's at MTP Connect. The job is to help people deliver really great research outcomes. So we just reach out and we can help you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo. That was really interesting to see everything that yeah, you guys fund, and just the wide variety of projects that are included in your schemes, your different schemes. Just want to see if anyone in the audience have any questions for Jo or Christine before we conclude the webinar.
I'm happy to kick off with one, Agustina, and this is for Christine. And you kind of did mention this, but I'm thinking about the change in government and the politics of that. And you probably are limited about what you can say, but I'm interested in how much the government cares about the MRFF. Is it an important sort of area? Obviously, it's a lot of money, but is there a spotlight on it, or is it actually something that's in the backwater? I mean, I was talking yesterday to someone about one of the big economic funds, which is also huge amounts of money. So I guess I'm just interested in what the political feel around health and medical research is, particularly the MRFF.
I don't think I can really comment in public on that at this point in time, but it's a good question, and there is no doubt that the role, I mean, anything that can play a role in improving the health of Australians, of which medical research is a pretty important part, will be a continuing focus of government interest.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
It's all right.
South Australian government changed very recently, and now the federal government changed, and we're thinking or trying to think carefully about how we advocate for the embedding of health and medical research in health services and how we fit that all together. So it's very important to get the sway into the demand being positioned by the health system instead of it being positioned just with the researchers. So I'm really interested in that all the time.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for your question, Wendy. I'm just going to go to the audience to see that Mark Boyd has a question. I think this will be our last question as we have 2 minutes left. Thanks, Mark. Oh, you're on mute, Mark.
So one of the questions that often comes up, and one of the worries and difficulties is, I guess, the gap between announcement of various schemes and deadline for applications is often quite short. And so it struck me really that probably the strategy in order to, be able to bridge that timeline is obviously starting much earlier in the announcement. And perhaps you need to, I guess what you're suggesting in your talk is you need to have all your partnerships and collaborations and ideas probably sketched out and wait for the kind of the correct scheme in order to be able to fit it in. Is that fair comment?
Yeah, look, two comments. We have been, much of the chief executives placed a lot of emphasis on trying to get the announcements out as early as you can. That's why we have so many forward announcements at the moment. So with the exception of the acute care grant, which we haven't really done any very fast grants in the last year. They've all had a long lead time. But I think your main point I completely agree with. It is about, creating, I don't know, for me, I'd be creating little one-page blueprints of potential things and potential partners and not working them out much beyond that. Maybe having one meeting with them, and then that, because they'll be thinking of you then when there's grant opportunities come that way. And I think that would put you in a better position for things coming forward. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the talk.
No, it's a pleasure.
All right. Well, I think on that note, I'll just share my screen to announce next week's webinar, which is about submitting a winning MRFF grant application and how we could grow success in South Australia. That'll be our second of 4 webinars. I'd like to thank Christine and Joe for joining us today and sharing all of that information about how to apply for MRFF money, either directly through the MRFF or through other avenues, like as Joe presented. So thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you to our presenters, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much.